My name is Naomi Ellison, and I'm 34 years old. Before the scandal carved our names into headlines, my world was small and good. I taught fourth grade at Riverside Elementary in Asheville. Mornings started with sharpened pencils and the soft thud of little sneakers crowding a classroom rug. After school, I walked past sycamores that shed bark like curled parchment, then drove home to a two-story rental with peeling blue shutters, where my son Lucas waited with a model rocket balanced like a promise across his knees. We were simple by design. Ethan Harrington, my boyfriend, could have had us living under vaulted ceilings and crystal pendants if he'd said yes to his father's terms. But Ethan chose a smaller life with me and our boy. Secondhand furniture, mismatched bowls, Saturday pancakes that never came out round. "We'll teach him what things cost," he whispered, when Lucas fell asleep on the sofa, cheeks flushed from the glue gun heroics of another science project. I believed him. I believed in us. Belief is a quiet, sturdy thing until something louder arrives. The Harringtons had money layered like sediment, old bank stock, commercial buildings with their name in brass, a family firm that treated the skyline like a chessboard. Douglas Harrington, Ethan's father, preferred the world crisp and compliant. He sat on hospital boards, joined black tie committees, and spoke the fluent platitudes of philanthropy. "Family comes first," he'd say, as if those 3 words were a key card that opened any door. It began on a Tuesday with fatigue Lucas couldn't explain. "Buddy, you didn't finish your worksheet," I said, brushing hair from his forehead. He leaned on my shoulder, heavy in a way that didn't feel like 9 years old. 10 days later, we had a diagnosis that rearranged the room: acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The letters landed like iron filings in my throat. Hospitals have their own weather. Time is fluorescent and sticky. Nurses move with engineered kindness. We learned the vocabulary you're never meant to know: counts, ports, protocols, chemo schedules that mapped a new, cruel calendar. Ethan took leave from the firm. I resigned from my classroom. We became the full-time staff of a small, stubborn miracle. Douglas arrived with a leather checkbook like a weapon. "No grandson of mine will be denied the best care," he declared, as if care and cure shared a price tag. He shook hands with men in windowed offices. He ordered food we didn't want and scolded us for not eating it. His suit jackets whispered when he moved. "Naomi," he told me, smoothing his cuff, "this is not the time to cling to principles. Use the machine." He meant his machine, the donors, the back doors, the calls that happen on private lines. "Lucas has a mother," I said. "He has parents." Ethan squeezed my fingers under the cafeteria table. His eyes said, "Peace, please." His father's eyes said, "Don't confuse decency with weakness." For a while there was hope. Dr. Morrison, our oncologist, had hands that made me trust her and a voice that never lied. "He's young," she said. "His heart is strong. These are advantages." We charted small victories: a good morning, a joke about the cafeteria mac and cheese, the way he'd memorize planetary data like spells. Then relapse tore through the progress like a storm through scaffolding. The last best option became a stem cell transplant. We tested everyone. Parents are rarely matches. Our blood betrayed the statistics. At 74, Douglas volunteered for the performance of it, then withdrew behind medical reality. In the end, my younger brother, Greg, was a partial match. Riskier, Dr. Morrison warned, but viable. We marked a date on the calendar, the earliest the body would be ready to receive the cells, and built our hope around it like the frame of a house. That same week, crisis spread sideways. Ethan's cousin Levi, a year older than Lucas, collapsed and was rushed to Duke. Some freak autoimmune malfunction had torched both kidneys. Dialysis, waiting list. The family's text thread became a contest between prayers. You learn what a dynasty means in a hospital hallway. Harringtons multiplied like echoes, arriving with soft voices and firm directives. William, Douglas's brother, brought spreadsheets of potential donor options for Levi and a golf buddy who knew a surgeon. Stephanie, Levi's mother, cried into napkins that left lint on her cheeks. Douglas traveled between Asheville and Duke with a footman's efficiency. The phrase "family comes first" began to sound less like love and more like strategy. We found relief in the simplest moments. I painted Lucas's nails clear to keep him from looking at the purple bruises blooming under his skin. We read about Europa's hidden oceans and the math of orbits. He drew a wish map, One boy with a new kidney, one boy with new blood, Thanksgiving in the middle with paper leaves taped to the window. Then the call came for Levi. It was 4 days after his name hit the transplant list when Stephanie phoned me, voice hiccuping with joy. They found a match, she said. Deceased donor, B positive. Surgery is tomorrow. In the silence that followed, I pictured Lucas's wish map and pressed my fingers hard into my eyes until stars burst there too. That's wonderful, I said, and meant it because children don't belong in purgatory. I told Lucas and watched a fierce light climb back into his face. I'll make Levi a card, he said, steadying the construction paper with slim wrists. He drew 2 boys standing under a big orange tree, one labeled kidney, one labeled cells, a crooked heart between them. He's probably scared, he added, the empathetic grace he didn't inherit from any Harrington. The next morning, ICU updates rolled in steady as tides. Excellent perfusion. Surgery successful. Levi's color is good. William sent a photo of a pale, triumphant boy, giving a shaky thumbs up. Ethan exhaled a prayer. I smiled until my mouth ached, and then I couldn't stop hearing the number, 4 days. It's not that a miracle can't land in the center of your family like a dove. It's that miracles with badges and board seats start to look like appointments. The waiting room TV burbled about a gala. A scrolling chyron listed sponsors. Harrington Foundation drifted by like a quiet signature. Douglas, on a call near the window, lowered his voice when he saw me watching. He turned his wrist and checked his watch, even though the phone told him the time. When he ended the call, he smiled the way you smile at a public event. Fortune's turn, he said, offering stale almonds from a crystal bowl. You'll see. Ethan tried to bridge the space between us. Dad didn't mean. I know what he meant, I said. I watched a nurse wheel a linen cart down the hall. I watched a resident laugh at something in a chart. I watched the second step neatly forward. Underneath the fluorescent hum, something inside me cataloged details. Dates, names, timing, the way Douglas's eyes slid past mine to the glass, as if his reflection were the more important witness. We went back to Lucas's room. He'd taped the card to the window, crooked and perfect, the heart slightly off-center. Thanksgiving, he said, tapping the word with a finger still flush pink from drawing. We'll both be better. Yeah, baby, I whispered. We will. I don't believe in omens, but I believe in the aftertaste of certain sentences. Family comes first. Fortune's turn. Use the machine. The words move through me like cold air through a house you can't afford to heat. That night, as Lucas slept, I stood in the alcove outside his room and watched snowflake lights blink on the children's ward tree. A volunteer straightened paper cranes. Down the corridor, Douglas shook hands with a man in a navy suit I'd seen at a fundraiser. Their heads tipped together like conspirators. When the man left, Douglas smoothed the front of his jacket and touched the silver pin on his lapel, the one he wore to board meetings and televised donations. Ethan found me leaning against the wall. You should sleep, he said, gentler than he felt. Exhaustion had carved parentheses around his mouth. Levi's match came in 4 days, I said, keeping my voice even, refusing the hysteria that would make me easy to dismiss. Is that normal? I don't know. He brushed his thumb across my knuckles. Maybe it was just luck. Maybe, I said. Luck that arrives with receipts has another name. He followed my gaze to where his father stood, phone glowing in his palm like a small, obedient moon. Ethan swallowed. Naomi. I know, I said again, but now I knew something else. I would remember every call time stamped in someone else's favor. I would remember the smell of sanitizer and almonds, and the way our son's paper heart leaned a fraction to the right, as if bracing for a wind only he could feel. 2 days later, Lucas's chemo intensified to prepare his body for Greg's cells. We circled the transplant date on a fresh printout of the calendar. Ethan drew a star next to it. Lucas added a comet tail that streaked across the margin. Make a wish, I told him, and he did, eyes shut tight, lashes dark crescents on his cheeks. He wished for 2 boys at a table in late November, for leftover pie and a parade on TV, for 2 recoveries that would be called miracles in that easy, generous way people like to use the word when they haven't seen what it costs. Outside the window, the city moved like always. Buses, brick, a river that didn't stop. Inside, I felt the machinery of something larger begin to turn, and I wasn't sure yet if it was hope or harm. The thing about hospitals is they never sleep. They just dim. Machines hum lullabies. Grief wears sneakers. You learn to read the difference between footsteps of nurses and footsteps of news. 2 days before the transplant, Lucas developed a fever that wouldn't break. Just a precaution, Dr. Morrison said, her brow tight with calculation. We'll run cultures. Start broad-spectrum antibiotics. By morning, the monitors had multiplied. Tubes tangled like questions. The fever climbed. His blood pressure dropped. A word I never wanted to hear again. Infection. We need to postpone, she said quietly. Postpone. It sounded so harmless, like rain delaying a picnic. But I saw the look she tried to hide. The same one she gave parents whose charts never cleared. Lucas drifted in and out, whispering half-dreams about rockets and stars. Ethan rubbed his temples until they went white. Douglas sent another specialist, his specialist, who repeated the same verdict. The infection must clear first, or the transplant would kill him. Weeks passed. Lucas's world shrank to the size of a sterile isolation room. We wore masks, gloves, gowns, our voices muffled behind plastic. The nurses called it protective isolation. It felt like exile. I kept journals then, lists of his vitals, small victories, and smaller losses. I wrote in tiny letters because I couldn't stand seeing the space between lines. When the infection finally lifted, Lucas had lost 12 pounds and every trace of color. Dr. Morrison stood at the foot of his bed, exhaustion hiding behind professional calm. The window is narrowing, she said, but I believe we still have a chance. Hope, the word we kept watering, even when the soil turned to dust. We set a new date. Ethan and I clung to it like it was a lifeline. Douglas arrived that afternoon with another donation form, this time for a children's cancer gala. Visibility helps research, he said, signing with the flourish of a man accustomed to applause. I wanted to scream that visibility didn't save children. Medicine did, timing did, ethics did. But grief teaches you silence. 3 days before the rescheduled transplant, Lucas's heart stopped. It was routine vitals, just another check before breakfast, and then alarms. I remember the flurry of blue scrubs, the shouted numbers, the mechanical rhythm of compressions. 7 minutes. 7 minutes that broke the world. They revived him, but not enough. A ventilator replaced his voice. The monitors steadied, but his eyes didn't open again. When Dr. Morrison finally spoke, her hands trembled around the clipboard. The transplant is no longer viable, she said softly. His body can't withstand it. Ethan crumpled into the chair beside the bed, the sound that came from him more animal than human. I stood, still holding Lucas's blanket like it could anchor me. How long? I asked. Days, she said, maybe a week? The rest was measured in breaths, shallow, slower, almost gentle. We read him space books, played his favorite recordings, told him he was brave. When his hand went still in mine, the room seemed to fold in on itself, a universe collapsing to silence. Afterward, time moved like syrup. The funeral came and went in a blur of lilies and whispered sympathies. Douglas paid for everything, signing checks like penance. He spoke of legacy and remembrance, his voice even, his eyes dry. Levi attended in a wheelchair, pale but healing. Stephanie clutched his shoulders, murmuring gratitude for what she called their second chance. I tried to look at her and couldn't. It wasn't resentment, not exactly. It was the unbearable arithmetic of loss. Their child lived, mine didn't. At the graveside, Douglas stood a step behind Ethan, hand firm on his son's shoulder. You have to stay strong, he said quietly. The family needs stability. The family. The word didn't include me anymore. Weeks turned to months. Ethan returned to work, throwing himself into blueprints and deadlines. I couldn't go back to teaching. I couldn't face children with eyes that might look like his. Our house became a museum. Lucas's room untouched. Glow-in-the-dark stars still faintly visible on the ceiling. We walked past it like tourists avoiding an exhibit too raw to name. Grief doesn't come in waves. It seeps into carpet fibers, light switches, the spaces between sentences. Ethan and I stopped touching. We stopped asking what the other needed because we already knew the answer. Nothing could fill the gap. Then, 7 months after Lucas's death, we went to a family dinner I didn't want to attend. Ethan begged me, just this once, for appearances. I wore black, still half convinced color would betray something sacred. Halfway through the meal, William raised a toast. To Levi's recovery, he said, smiling proudly. A miracle, really. Perfect match, perfect timing. 4 days, Stephanie added softly, as if repeating a prayer. 4 days after he was listed. Something in me snapped. 4 days. The number that had followed me through nightmares, hospital hallways, and silent mornings. I set my glass down carefully. 4 days? Stephanie blinked, startled by my voice. Yes, Thursday evening. They called just 4 days after the paperwork cleared. Douglas's fork paused midair. Across the table, his gaze met mine. Polite, sharp, warning. That's remarkably fast, I said. Isn't the average wait time for B-positive months? The Harrington luck, Douglas said smoothly, recovering. His smile didn't reach his eyes. We've always had good fortune in critical moments. Good fortune, that was one way to name it. Dinner continued. Laughter, wine, stories. But sound came to me through cotton. I watched Douglas refill his glass, his hand steady now, too steady. He'd done something. I could feel it in the stillness between words, in the way he avoided my gaze but listened for my silence. Later, when the others drifted toward the living room, I followed him to his study. About that scholarship fund, I said, closing the door behind me. He turned, surprise flickering and then smoothing into charm. Naomi, I didn't realize you were still here. I stepped closer. Levi's transplant, 4 days on the list. That's not luck. He frowned, pouring scotch into a glass. You're letting grief distort. Don't, I said, sharper than I meant. Just answer me. Did you have anything to do with it? Everything I've done, he said quietly, has been for this family. My stomach twisted. What exactly did you do, Douglas? He didn't answer, and that silence was louder than a confession. When I left his house that night, I knew I'd just spoken to a man capable of trading one child's life for another's and sleeping through it. Outside, the rain had started, soft and cold. I stood under the portico, staring at my reflection in the marble floor, and felt the first spark of something I hadn't felt in months, clarity. Grief had drowned me, but rage would teach me to breathe again. It began with a name whispered over coffee. I met Natalie Brooks at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place where grief could hide behind steam and white mugs. She had been one of the nurses who stayed late during Lucas's chemo nights, the one who'd quietly slipped me extra blankets and stories about her own kids when the machines got too loud. Is there any way, I asked carefully, for someone to move a patient up the transplant list? Officially or not? Natalie's hand froze on her latte spoon. Officially, no. The system is designed to be airtight. Medical urgency, compatibility, waiting time, all weighted and recorded. And unofficially? She hesitated, eyes flicking toward the window. There have been rumors. Sometimes large donations are made to hospital foundations right before certain approvals move faster. Nothing proven, of course, but the timing sometimes is convenient. Convenient, that word echoed all the way home. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by unopened mail and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I made a list, people, dates, institutions, and circled Douglas's name in the center like the nucleus of a cell. I wasn't ready to confront Ethan, not without proof. He still saw his father through the lens of loyalty, not leverage. Natalie gave me a contact, Lawrence Bennett, an independent investigator, specializing in medical ethics violations. His voice, when he finally answered, was calm but clipped. These cases are notoriously hard to prove, he said. Without internal documentation or financial records, it's your word against a system that protects itself. I don't need rumors, I replied. I need facts. He agreed to dig, quietly. For 6 weeks, I lived 2 lives. By day, I pretended to heal. Yoga classes I didn't finish. Casseroles I didn't eat. Polite small talk at grief groups. By night, I became something sharper. Printing public filings, tracking donations, noting every press release that mentioned the Harrington Foundation. The dates started aligning like constellations. Then, one cold November afternoon, Lawrence called. His voice carried the weight of discovery. I need to see you in person, he said. We met in Hendersonville, far from the Harrington name's shadow. The cafe smelled like burnt sugar and rain-soaked coats. He slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were printed bank statements, donation receipts, and a single highlight that made my stomach twist. $350,000, wired from a Harrington-controlled company, to a charitable foundation run by the transplant director's wife. The date, 2 days before Levi's match notification. I stared until the ink blurred. Lawrence spoke softly, as though breaking bad news to a patient. This isn't conclusive proof, but the timing is extraordinary. 3 patients with more urgent needs were bypassed that same week. I closed the folder slowly. My hands trembled, but my voice didn't. What do I do now? You could go to the hospital's ethics board, or the press. But Naomi... His eyes searched mine. This family has power. They'll fight dirty, and your son, nothing changes that outcome. This isn't about changing the past, I said, my voice cold with new purpose. It's about stopping it from happening again. When I got home, Ethan was sitting at the dining table, reviewing architectural plans. He looked up, smiling faintly. You were gone a while. I met someone, I said, setting my coat on the chair. An investigator. His pencil fell from his hand. Naomi, what? I laid the folder on the table between us. For a long time, he didn't move. Then he opened it, read, went still. When he finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. My father. He bought Levi's place on the list, I said quietly. He bribed the transplant director through that foundation. Ethan pushed back from the table, hands gripping his hair. I always knew he could pull strings, but this? Lucas might still be alive, I said, and the words broke open something inside me I'd been holding shut for months. He looked up, eyes red-rimmed. What do you want to do? I want to hear him say it. We drove to Douglas's estate that night. The iron gates opened automatically, as if the house already knew we were coming. Inside, the air smelled of scotch and old wood. Douglas stood in his study, surprise flickering across his face before hardening into annoyance. This is unexpected, he said smoothly. Naomi, Ethan. I set the folder on his desk. We know about the donation. His eyes shifted, assessing, calculating. Where did you get this? Does it matter? Ethan said, his voice low and shaking. 4 days. Levi waited 4 days. You paid to move him ahead of my son. Douglas's jaw clenched. Lower your voice. I stepped forward. You traded a child's life for your reputation, for family image, for control. You don't understand, he said sharply. Everything I've done has been for this family. Lucas was your family, I snapped. He was your grandson. Ethan's voice broke completely. My son is dead because of you. Douglas slammed his glass onto the desk. I made a charitable donation. Hospitals depend on private funding. You made a bribe, I said, and I recorded this conversation. That stopped him. For the first time, fear flickered across his face. What do you want? He asked quietly. Money? An endowment in Lucas's name? We want justice, Ethan said, and the truth on record. We walked out as he shouted after us, threats and bargains tangled in the same breath. The next morning, we delivered everything to the state medical board, the hospital's ethics committee, and a journalist who'd built her career exposing corruption in healthcare. By evening, the story had a pulse. Within a week, the investigation began. The transplant director was placed on leave. The foundation was audited. Anonymous sources confirmed that the donation had coincided with a sudden reshuffling of priority cases. The Harrington name, once a symbol of respect, started appearing in headlines alongside words like bribery and favoritism. Douglas's phone stopped ringing, and for the first time since Lucas's death, I could finally breathe without guilt. But breathing didn't mean peace, because behind every victory was a new wound. Levi, now 11, overheard everything. At dinner one night, he asked his parents, voice trembling, "Does this mean they'll take my kidney back?" That question spread through the family like poison, and Douglas's empire, so carefully built, was beginning to collapse. The week the investigation went public, the Harrington family mansion stopped being a home. It became a fortress. Reporters camped at the end of the driveway, news vans lined the street, and drones buzzed like mechanical wasps above the sculpted hedges. The headline on every channel was the same: prominent Asheville philanthropist under investigation for transplant bribery. Douglas's voice, once the gospel of boardrooms, now trembled through his lawyer's statements. A tragic misunderstanding, purely charitable intent. He was unraveling. But so were we. Ethan hadn't spoken to his father since that night. He spent hours on the phone with attorneys, hospital administrators, anyone who would listen. I answered journalists' calls only to say one thing: my son deserved an equal chance. Behind the media noise, the truth began stitching itself together. Internal audits confirmed that Douglas had wired $350,000 through a shell company, DHS Civic Holdings, LLC. 2 days before Levi's match appeared in the donor system. 3 patients, including a 10-year-old boy from Charlotte, had been bypassed. Lawrence Bennett's findings were validated by independent investigators. What started as suspicion was now fact. The state ethics board filed formal charges. Federal prosecutors followed within days. Bribery, conspiracy, and abuse of position on a hospital board. When the news reached Douglas, he didn't deny it. He tried to justify it. "My grandson was dying," he said during a deposition, his voice caught on the edge of desperation. "I couldn't lose another child in this family. I did what any man with resources would have done." But that excuse didn't absolve him. It damned him. Ethan watched the televised hearing in silence. "He still calls it saving," he murmured, "not stealing." I nodded, because he's never had to earn anything the right way. The fallout was brutal and fast. The transplant director resigned under investigation. The foundation was dissolved. The hospital board implemented new oversight laws for donation transparency. The media dubbed it the Harrington Reforms. To Douglas, it was humiliation, something worse than guilt. His social circle collapsed overnight. The same people who'd once begged for his presence at galas now deleted his name from event rosters. Even William, his brother, his lifelong ally, stopped taking his calls. Stephanie's voice cracked when she called me weeks later. "We didn't know, Naomi. Please believe that. We were just grateful he lived." "I believe you," I said quietly, "but belief doesn't erase what he did." There was a long pause. "Levi cries every night," she whispered. "He thinks it's his fault." "It's not," I said firmly. "He's just a child. None of this belongs to him." But the truth was, it belonged to all of us now. Ethan and I were summoned to testify before the ethics panel. The room was cold, lined with portraits of men who'd built institutions on trust. When my turn came, I read from my notes, voice steady but shaking underneath. My son, Lucas Ellison, was 9 years old when he died, waiting for a transplant. 4 days after another child, my boyfriend's cousin, was placed on the waiting list, he received a match. That child deserved his life, but so did mine. And no family's wealth should decide who lives or dies. The panel members didn't look away. They didn't interrupt. For the first time in nearly a year, I felt seen, not as a grieving mother, but as a witness. The verdict came down a month later. Douglas was guilty of bribery, fraud, and ethical misconduct. He accepted a plea deal to avoid trial, cooperating with investigators to expose similar cases across the state. The man who once signed million-dollar donations to children's hospitals now faced 4 years in federal prison and $2.3 million in fines. When the sentence was read, Ethan exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since the day Lucas died. "He'll never understand what he took from us," he said. "No," I replied, watching the reporters swarm the courthouse steps. "But now the world will." In the weeks that followed, we dismantled what remained of the Harrington Empire from our own lives. Ethan resigned from the firm and opened a small architecture practice, one that designed affordable housing instead of penthouses. We sold our house on Brookdale Avenue, the one with Lucas's glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. The night before the move, I lay on his bed and let the last traces of his world soak into me. Douglas's lawyers reached out one final time, offering a gesture of reconciliation, a trust fund in Lucas's name, financed entirely by Harrington Holdings. I sent it back unopened. Our future wouldn't be built with his blood money. Instead, we started something smaller but real, the Lucas Ellison Memorial Scholarship, funded by community donations and my return to teaching part-time. Each year, it sends one student to study science, space, medicine, anything that looks up instead of down. When the scholarship was announced, an email arrived from an unfamiliar address. It was Levi. "I'm sorry for everything my grandfather did. I wish your son was here. I wish it had been fair. I still have the card he made me, the one with the orange tree." I didn't reply right away. Some things deserve silence before words. When I finally did, I wrote, "You didn't do this, Levi. None of us chose how the adults acted, but you can choose what you do with the life you were given. Make it matter." He wrote back 2 weeks later, a photo attached. A model rocket, paper wings taped in orange and red. "For Lucas," the caption read. I cried for the first time in months. Tears that didn't feel like drowning, but like thawing. In the end, justice didn't bring peace. It brought clarity. And sometimes, that's enough. The morning after Douglas's sentencing, Asheville felt cleaner. The air carried that strange quiet that comes after a storm. Not peace, but the pause before everyone starts rebuilding. The news anchors called it the Harrington scandal. The talking heads debated ethics and wealth and fairness, but for me, it was simpler. A man's money had bought another child's life, and my son had paid the cost. Douglas was transferred to a low-security federal facility in South Carolina. 4 years. That was all. 4 years for bribery, for deception, for everything that had cracked our family open. Ethan didn't go to the sentencing. He said he couldn't watch his father in handcuffs. "I've already buried one parent," he told me quietly. "That's enough funerals." We stopped being Harrington adjacent after that. Ethan changed his last name back to his mother's, Reed, and rebranded his new architecture firm under it. The first building he designed wasn't for profit. It was a small housing complex for families displaced by medical debt. He said he wanted it to be a place where people start over without shame. I started over too, not by forgetting, but by finding purpose again. Teaching felt impossible for months, but eventually I walked back into a classroom. Fourth graders again. When I told them about the scholarship in Lucas's name, they asked if he'd been one of my students. "In a way," I said, "he taught me how to be brave." The Lucas Ellison Memorial Scholarship grew faster than I expected. Donations poured in, small ones, handwritten notes folded with $10 bills. No family crests, no marble plaques, just strangers who wanted to help. By spring, 3 students had received full rides to college, all studying biology, all chasing light. Sometimes at those award ceremonies, I'd see Levi standing in the back of the crowd. He never spoke publicly. He didn't have to. We'd just exchange a nod, a silent acknowledgement of what we'd both lost and what still connected us. He was 14 the last time I saw him, taller now, carrying a folder of his science fair designs. "Astrobiology," he told me shyly. "I want to study if bacteria can survive on Mars." I smiled. Lucas would have loved that. He glanced down, then reached into his backpack. "I brought something," he said. It was that same drawing, the crooked paper heart and the 2 boys under the orange tree. The crayon colors had faded, but the lines still held. "I keep it above my desk," he whispered. "It reminds me that I owe my life to someone I never got to thank." I touched his shoulder, "Then live in a way that thanks him every day." After Levi left, I sat in my car for a long time, holding that memory until it steadied me. The world had moved on. New scandals, new headlines. But for us, the story lingered in the spaces no one reported. In the way Ethan's voice softened when he said Lucas's name. In the way I still set an extra plate at Thanksgiving before realizing. We'd never get closure, not really. But we'd built something stronger, accountability. The transplant system, once a fortress of secrecy, now required public disclosure of all donations and independent board oversight. It wasn't perfect. Power always finds cracks, but it was better. A journalist who'd followed our case wrote to me one day, asking if I had regrets. I thought about the question for a long time before answering. "Yes," I wrote back. "I regret that I didn't see the signs sooner, but I don't regret speaking out. I'd rather live with a broken family than a clean conscience that stayed silent." Douglas sent one letter from prison. The handwriting was rigid, still formal. "Naomi, I've lost everything, but I still believe I saved a life. Perhaps someday you'll understand what it means to choose one child over another when both are dying. Douglas." I never wrote back. There are apologies that don't belong to the living. Instead, I stood on the porch of our new house in West Asheville, smaller, humbler, but ours, and looked at the night sky. It was clear, cold, and endless. Somewhere up there, Lucas's favorite constellations were burning. "Look, baby," I whispered. "They're still shining." Ethan came outside, wrapping an arm around me. "You okay?" "Not yet," I said, "but I'm getting there." He nodded, his chin against my hair. "He'd be proud of you, you know." I smiled faintly. He'd be proud of both of us. The wind carried the faint hum of the city, children laughing, a siren in the distance, the world still spinning forward. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel left behind. Because justice hadn't brought peace, but it had brought meaning. And meaning was enough to keep going. If you ever find yourself at that edge, where doing what's right costs everything, ask yourself one question. What's the worth of silence when truth is the only thing that can set a child's name free? For me, the answer is simple. Lucas didn't die in vain. His story changed the system. And that, finally, has to be enough.